With all the competition for our entertainment hours, it's harder than ever to keep readers reading, to keep them glued to the page. But the task is made so much easier if you can apply one simple rule to your writing: tension on every page. Now, I can already hear the protests. Every page, are you sure? Yes, every page, and it's not so hard as you might think. In this video, we're going to talk about tension, the different types of tension, how to use those different types to keep readers engaged, how to vary the levels of tension so readers don't become numb to it. As in my other mastering fiction videos, I'll be using the Hunger Games as an example. I realize I've been using the Hunger Games quite a bit, and I'll break from that in coming videos, but I felt it was important to have continuity between these core videos, using a book that was widely read and was a bit more mainstream and not too deep into fantasy or science fiction. As in most of my videos, the advice is going to be tailored somewhat to fantasy and science fiction, but I think this one in particular applies to all types of fiction. We've rounded the bend in my Mastering Fiction series. So far, we've talked about brainstorming, world building, character creation, plotting, and how to write a scene. This is part 6. And I just wanted to pass on a small bit of advice. While the videos are self-contained and you can watch them on their own, they do build on one another. So if you're somewhat new to writing, or you want a bit of a refresher after having been away for a while, or you just want a more well-rounded look at the writing process from beginning to end, consider watching them in order. I have 2 more videos ready to go, and a couple more to round out the series, plus some more planned Scrivener videos, including how to compile. So be sure to subscribe to be notified when those come out. Hi, I'm Brad Beaulieu, and I'm a full-time fantasy and science fiction author. I've published a dozen novels, more than 20 short stories, and I love talking about the craft of writing, which is why I started this channel, A Novel Approach. A Novel Approach is dedicated to helping you reach your writing goals by sharing inspiration, technique, and my 20-plus years of experience in writing and publishing. We're going to get into the main content in just a sec, but before we do, I wanted to let you know that this video doesn't have a sponsor, but it is supported by those of you who get value out of these instructional videos and spread the word. Maybe buy me a coffee on coffee.com, link in the description below, and even buy signed books from my online store at quillings.com. Thanks so much for your continued support. It's because of you that I can continue to make free videos just like this one. And for those of you who are new, please consider subscribing so you can keep up on all the latest tips, tricks, and deep dive techniques I'm adding on writing. Okay, so let's get started. I like to start with the origin of each talk, and if you've seen any of my other videos, you'll know that I didn't come to writing early, and it was a struggle for me to understand how stories worked. I needed to know more about story mechanics. Why did some stories work so well while others fail to engage? The title of this talk is Tension on Every Page, but what is tension? It's Luke in Star Wars wanting to go to the academy, but Uncle Lars says no. It's Katniss Everdeen seeing Peeta betray her by joining the careers from District 1 and 2 inside of the arena. It's Agnieszka from Uprooted, Naomi Novik's wonderful book, being chosen as the dragon's next apprentice and not really knowing what that means for her. It's Lumen Enterprises creating technology to make people unable to remember their workday in Severance, the Apple series. It's Sam and Frodo pining for the Shire on their way to Mount Doom. It's humanity standing on the brink of collapse in Jason Huff's Zombie Plague trilogy that begins with the Darwin elevator. It's Rey from the most recent Star Wars trilogy wondering who her parents are. It's Nicolas Cage in Leaving Las Vegas drinking himself to death. Much of this talk comes from really just a couple of pages that Don Maass wrote about in his excellent book, Writing the Breakout Novel. This is a really good book told by a guy who knows the industry inside and out. Don is a literary agent, and he's also written some books himself, fiction books, and also how-to books. So he really knows how stories work, and he diagnosed a bunch of bestsellers, some of which he repped in preparing for this book, Writing the Breakout Novel. And so it's a really good book in general to understand why some stories break out and what lessons can be learned from them and how you can apply those to your own writing. But he spent really just a couple, 2.5 pages on this notion of tension on every page, but it really struck a chord with me. We all have these light bulb moments in writing where we go, oh wow, I just didn't realize that, and that makes perfect sense to me now that someone has told it to me, and this was one for me, and so that's what this talk is about. And so the contention in that book is that not only should tension be present during high points, turning points, plot twists, chapter ends, the story climax, it should be present on every page. And we only need to look at certain genres for proof. The thriller is known for this kind of thing, just putting the pedal to the metal all the way through a book. but mysteries and romances as well, and a variety of breakout novels regardless of genre. To start, let's look at a definition of story and how tension plays a role in the story arc. So the story begins, and we have this timeline. And very often the opening chapter of a book is showing them in their normal life, and we see more or less what the old norm looks like. And then the inciting incident comes into play. It's where the external events on the part of the antagonist and others sort of collide with the internal arc of the main character and sends them on some new path. And much of the story from that point forward is to try to get things back like they were. And so that builds towards the climax, and we wrap up the story with a denouement at the end. Let's talk about rising tension. We have the inciting incident at the beginning, and we have this notion of rising tension until we get to the climax, and then we have a notable drop off as we get to the denouement. Note that the level of tension is going to vary throughout a novel. We are not saying that we go full bore at all times throughout the story. We're going to have these peaks and valleys where the characters have time to digest what happened, to make new plans, for a little bit of respite before they get back into the thick of things. That's natural. But generally speaking, we'll never get back to that level of tension that we were at the beginning of the story. It's going to continue to rise on average until we get to the climax, and only then does it really drop heavily. But we'll see later on that it's not gone entirely, even in the denouement. Note also that the types of tension are going to vary, and we're going to spend a lot of time on that coming up. So when I first read this, I was like, that seems kind of hard. Is that really what we want to do in fiction? And it does seem difficult, if not impossible at first. And yet, most breakout novels do this well. Can a story become too tense? Can you push too far? Yes, you can. And we'll talk about that a bit later on. But probably not. I've read hundreds of manuscripts at this point, and it's much more common, especially for newer writers, to not push hard enough, to not have enough tension. There are whole swaths of the manuscript that just lag. And so it's difficult to do. And if you find that you've done that, either through beta readers or just reading your manuscript yourself, you can always pull back. And we'll touch on that, how to slow things down a bit if needed. So I mentioned we're going to use the Hunger Games. Just as a reminder, I want to go over the cast. So we have Katniss, the protagonist, and she is from District 12. There were 13 districts. At this point in the story, we think that one of them was completely destroyed in a war, so there are 12 left. And there is a yearly Hunger Games in which a boy and a girl tribute from the ages of 12 to 18 are selected in an event known as the Reaping. Those 24 kids then go to an arena that changes each year, and they all fight until one is left, the victor. And this is a form of control by the government over these various districts. So Katniss volunteers to take her sister's place. Peeta is the boy tribute chosen from District 12. They're roughly the same age. And Haymitch is a former Hunger Games winner. He was the victor some 24 years ago, and he's a mentor to any of the new tributes that come from District 12. And so he's expected to mentor Katniss and Peeta, except he doesn't want to. He's seen a bunch of kids die in the games that he played in, but then also afterwards as a mentor, he's sent these kids off and they've all died. And now we come to Katniss and Peeta. And Haymitch is an alcoholic at this point. He doesn't want to engage with these kids who he thinks are going to die. And then we have President Snow, who is the cruel ruler of this country in a near future North America called Panem. There's Gale from District 12, who is a love interest of Katniss. He completes a love triangle between Katniss, Peeta, and Gale himself. And then there's the Capitol and the arena, which act as characters of sorts. And so what we're going to do is to go over some examples, and we're going to start with the very opening. This is the first page of the Hunger Games, the first paragraph. When I wake up, the other side of the bed is cold. My fingers stretch out, seeking Prim's warmth, but finding only the rough canvas cover of the mattress. She must have had bad dreams and climbed in with our mother. Of course she did. This is the day of the reaping. So is there tension in this first paragraph? Well, with one word, reaping, and the name of the book, The Hunger Games, Collins creates tension. We're wondering what the reaping is and how it leads to the Hunger Games and how Katniss is going to be involved. Also, why does Prim sleep with Katniss? Her mother, we find out later, checked out after her father died in a mining accident. He was blown to bits in this accident, and she became deeply depressed, and Katniss was forced to take over as the mother figure of this family. We don't know that at this point, but we're starting to get clues that Katniss is a mother figure to Prim and even her mother at times. Then we come to the second paragraph. I prop myself up on one elbow. There's enough light in the bedroom to see them. my little sister Prim, curled up on her side, cocooned in my mother's body, their cheeks pressed together. In sleep, my mother looks younger, still worn, but not so beaten down. Prim's face is as fresh as a raindrop, as lovely as the primrose for which she was named. My mother was very beautiful once too, or so they tell me. Collins has laid out clues to give hint to the danger this family is in. We don't understand the nature of the danger, but we know there's danger. Also note that this is not a helter-skelter sort of tension. That's not what we're getting at when we say tension on every page. There are all different kinds, and we're starting pretty low. I mean, they're sleeping and waking up and getting ready for what's going to be a very difficult day. And we're starting to get clues about what that day entails early on and who this family is, this small family unit. There's a danger for the newer writer. It isn't necessary to fill each page with maximum tension. It's also a mistake to fill your pages with the same kind of tension. Why? Because when the reader feels too much of the same thing, they become numb to it. I like to use the example of George Carlin, a comedian whose heyday was in like the 70s and 80s, early 90s. And he had this bit where he talked about hopping in the car and you go across town and you turn on the radio and you go and do this thing and that thing, and eventually you return home and you go inside. And the next day you go back in the car, you turn it on, and the radio is super loud. And the reason that happens is because we got numb to the volume the radio was at driving around, and we slowly turned it up more and more. And so I like to use that for fiction and tension as well. If you just present the same type of action, argument, what have you, over and over again, the reader will become numb to it. Imagine a fighting sequence, a fencing sequence, where the characters just go back and forth using the same moves over and over again. You really quickly get bored of that kind of stuff. And so we want to vary the types of tension that we're using and the levels of tension as well. So let's talk about that varied tension. A successful novel needs to vary the level of tension throughout, but also the types of tension. Mysteries like Sherlock Holmes still pack adventure into the pages. Within Lord of the Rings, Frodo is pining for his days in the Shire, even as he's heading steadily closer to Mount Doom. And so what kind of varied tension do we have in The Hunger Games? Well, within a few pages, we learn a little bit more about District 12. The very name, first of all, implies some sort of government control. The coal mining families are sleeping in. It's the reaping, so why not get a bit of extra sleep? And so this is a formal event, an official event, and you get the sense that people are required to go. There is an electrified fence meant to keep predators out and people in. Leaving the boundaries is a punishable offense. Merely owning a bow is much worse. You will be marked as a rebel and likely killed for it. Katniss's father was blown to bits, as I mentioned, in a mine explosion, and Katniss still wakes up screaming for him to run. So this still affects her. Our understanding of Katniss's world is deepening. Collins is creating a crucible, showing us the way in which Katniss was forged. And by world, I mean the extent to which Katniss knows her world. She talks a lot about District 12, but very little of the other districts. She knows of them, of course, but hasn't been to them, so how can she? And so we're starting to deepen our understanding of District 12 and what that means, and the government that controls this district and all the others. Using setting to deepen character and plot should be done subtly and often. It creates a layering effect that helps to fill in the world. Said another way, setting should do more than just describe the surroundings. This is a crucial skill to build. You want to make all of your words perform double, triple, quadruple duty. I'm going to spend some time in another video talking about that in a lot more detail. But I wanted to introduce this concept of making your words do more than what they're just saying, more than just the literal value of those words. They should reveal as much about character, world, and plot as possible. Once Katniss gets outside, she goes to this place where she and Gale often meet. And we get to this passage. In the woods waits the only person with whom I can be myself, Gale. I can feel the muscles in my face relaxing, my pace quickening as I climb the hills to our place, a rock ledge overlooking a valley. A thicket of berry bushes protects it from unwanted eyes. The sight of him waiting there brings on a smile. Gale says I never smile except in the woods. Hey, Catnip, says Gale. And so we feel the tension shed from Katniss like rain, but a new tension replaces it, romantic tension. So Collins was confident enough to pull back on the reaping and the Hunger Games and all that and switch things up. Now that was partly because we need to know Gale. We need to know his point in the love triangle that's about to form. But at the same time, that new interest, that tension between them keeps reader interest high as we learn more about Katniss, her relationship to Gale, their dual relationship to the games and the reaping itself. Everything I've talked about has happened in the first 5 pages. The pages are rife with tension, and it's not a helter-skelter sort of tension, but a varied tension that creates a landscape. Let's talk about short-term versus long-term tension. Things like action, a fight, or an argument have naturally high tension, but also very short half-lives. A half-life is a property of radioactive material, and if you have a certain amount of radioactivity and a certain amount of mass, the half-life defines how quickly it will get to half of that radioactivity as the material decays. And so things with very short half-lives have this kind of sharp decline, and things with longer half-lives have kind of a very slower decline over time. And so the tension that you build as an author from putting in a fight scene can be quite high, but it will quickly fade in the reader's mind. It's the long building tension that keeps readers interested over the course of a novel. We have to mix these two. We are introduced to the lottery more formally in the following pages. One boy and one girl are chosen through a lottery system, and Colin spends several pages detailing the number of entries both Katniss and especially Gale had in the story. You get one entry of your name in a punch bowl for the first year that you're in, another for the second, third, fourth. You have 7 years of eligibility, and so older kids have more chances to be chosen for the Hunger Games. And you can also get what's known as tesserae for food and oil to live on, subsist on. And in order to do that, these younger kids like Gale have to enter their name more times. So each time you get one of those tesserae, you add another ticket to the bowl, to the punch bowl, to be chosen. And so Gale has a bunch, so does Katniss, as they come to the reaping ceremony where those names are chosen. Prim, on the other hand, has one. It's her first year of eligibility. And so we're thinking in those early pages, Katniss is going to go, obviously. She's the main protagonist. And Gale has so many entries in the punch bowl, we're thinking, well, they were introduced, and so they're going to go to the games together and maybe have to fight one another or something. But then we're struck by a bombshell. Prim is the one chosen as the girl tribute, and Katniss, knowing that she's going to die, volunteers for her. But that's something that Katniss hardly considered before that point. There was so much time spent on Gale and Katniss's chances, that was a bit of a red herring to pull the rug out from under us and choose Prim instead, and then have some high drama when Katniss takes her place, and Gale is not the one chosen for the boys. Peeta Mellark is chosen instead. When we talk about long-term tension, one great example is the Hunger Games themselves, the driver behind the novel. And yet, Collins waits 11 chapters, 148 pages in the paperback I was reading at the time, before Katniss is lifted into the arena. 40% of the novel has passed before we actually make it to the arena. And we don't know, the kids don't know, what form the arena is going to take because it changes every year. These game masters sort of design the arena and devise ways to get the kids to kill one another in the end, if they're unwilling to fight. In other words, Collins held off on the gratification she knew the reader wanted before giving it to them. So let's talk about that. Delaying gratification is a key skill for the writer. Said another way, if you give the reader what they want, interest drops. Whether it's sex, a fight, a hellacious argument, tension drops when that release occurs. An example is any kind of rom-com where you get two people together while the characters are circling around the interest they have for one another. The tension is quite high, and then when they do get together, tension drops. Admittedly, delaying isn't easy, and waiting too long can make the story boring. So what does Collins do in the meantime? She fills the story with the false grandeur of the capital. The people there are very ostentatious, very, very different from District 12. And the districts themselves are quite different from one another, going from dirt poor in District 12 to quite rich and people who revere the games in District 1 and 2, and then the capital itself. There's also this coming out ceremony where the kids are paraded a la the Roman Empire through this arena on chariots, and Katniss has a stylist who gives her a dress that bursts into flame as they go into this arena, and the crowd cheers, and it's the first time that they really take note of the kids from District 12. And there's also the pre-games. Before we get to the actual arena, the kids have to sort of parade themselves and display their skills to sponsors who can give them things inside of the games, but in order to do that, they have to garner the interest of those people. And Katniss hates it. She does not want to do it. I mean, she's being forced to go into the games to begin with, which is bad enough, and then she has to parade before the people who are allowing that to happen. And so that is part of the tension that is played out before the kids actually get to the arena and the fight for survival and their lives when they get there. Another example of long-term tension is the romance angle between Katniss and Peeta. Collins wisely introduced us to Gale early, so we had some understanding of the person that Katniss likes. They talk at one point about running away together, perhaps with their families. And then we're introduced to Peeta, and we learn that Peeta has liked Katniss for quite some time. And under different circumstances, she might even have come to like/love Peeta, but with the games, it seems an impossibility. They're going into an arena where they're going to be forced to fight other kids, and possibly, if they're the last two to survive, one another. And so early in the games, after they enter the arena, Peeta apparently betrays Katniss. He seems to have allied himself with the careers from District 1 and 2, who want to take Katniss out. Katniss later realizes she was wrong, and this strengthens their bond. And only then, when they're relying on one another very closely, just the two of them, does the romance begin to blossom. But it's soured by the acting they have to do for the sponsors. In the arena, it's televised, and there are cameras everywhere. And so they positioned themselves, Peeta did, as star-crossed lovers. They liked one another, and they were both chosen to go into the games. And so they continue that act as they make it into the arena to try to get sympathy from the sponsors to get stuff inside of the games. But that forces Katniss to go along with the ruse. And so even though she does like Peeta, she hates having to perform this way. And so that's another thing that kind of keeps them apart. And this plays out over the course of much of the novel. So definitely long-term tension. We also want a variation in the landscape. Fiction has peaks and valleys. We talked about that rising tension and that it's not going to just keep rising at a steady pace. We're going to have some times where the characters can sit back and digest things that have happened, make new plans, that sort of thing. But there's danger in those valleys. You run the risk of making swaths of your story boring or lackluster. And you can combat that by weaving in threads from long-term tension into those lower, not low tension, but lower tension scenes. For example, when Katniss is lamenting over Gale, it isn't as high tension as her flaming dress in that ceremony, but it's tension just the same. And it plays against other ongoing concerns, her worry over her family, even Gale's family, raising interest from sponsors, their lack of training from Haymitch, who again is an alcoholic and doesn't want to face getting to know them just to have them die, just like all the other kids have since he won the games 20-some years ago. So what kinds of tension do we have in the Hunger Games? There's action and argument. There's this romantic tension that we talked about. There's mystery. For example, when Peeta allies himself with the careers, Katniss doesn't understand why. She doesn't know what's going on. There's survival once they make it to the arena. There's suspense. Will they be trained in time? What form will the games take? The arena itself is a brilliant construction on Collins' part. It touches on James Dye's three basic conflict types: internal, warring with yourself; external, warring with the world in some way; and relational, warring between characters. It also contains 5 of the 7 main literary conflict types. Character versus character, it's pretty obvious. I mean, the kids are fighting one another. Character versus nature. The arena is part natural land that they cordon off and part technology. It's science fictional in nature. The game masters can bring things into being. And so the kids are fighting both one another, but also nature. They have to survive. And also technology. If things are created like these huge dogs that chase these kids into one area so they fight one another, or they might die to those dogs if they're not fierce enough. And then character versus self. They wonder all the time if they should go along with this stuff. Katniss does, certainly. And then character versus society. The society that's allowing these Hunger Games to take place. The other two, the two that are missing, are character versus the supernatural, or God or gods, and character versus fate. But there are other conflict types as well. We have conflicts in our upbringing, our relationships with those around us. Societal. What does society expect of us? What does our family expect of us? What do our parents expect? What do our children expect of us? Our siblings? Our own expectations and moral codes. What do we want for ourselves? What was our 5-year plan and are we meeting it? That sort of thing. This is why world building is so important, because it leads to and helps all of this stuff. If you create the right sort of world or situation in our own world, it will lend itself to certain conflict types and enhance what might otherwise have been a low-key type of tension in a story. Building tension. Tension builds through scenes and subplots, and just as a novel has peaks and valleys, so do scenes. Each scene should either advance the plot or set it back. So as you're going through your editing, one of the things you have to do is to determine if each scene actually does that or not. Even those lower tension scenes should do that in some way or another. They should be closer to their goal or further away from their goal by the end of every scene. It's a simple rule, and yet so many writers fail to do this. Why? Well, one reason is because writing tension-filled scenes is hard. We live our words. We inhabit our characters as we're writing about them. And so that's difficult at times. And we want to subconsciously, I think, give them and maybe ourselves a bit of a break. It's easy for us to pull back, but we have to override that natural inclination and get tension into the story and keep it present, even in those lower tension scenes throughout the story. There's danger in the peaks as well. I mentioned early on, can it become too tense? Yeah, sometimes, and you should rely on beta readers to help you here. I often have beta readers read something and give me feedback with no prompting from me first, and then I ask them specific questions. And you can ask some things like this, like, was it ever too much? Do I need to pull back in some areas to give the characters some breathing space? What may be happening in those sections, if you find them, is that there isn't enough connection to the protagonist. And having that connection can slow things down, isn't the right word exactly, but just create a better emotional connection between reader and character. Reading is enjoyable because we become those characters. And if there's no emotional connection, we don't care what happens to the main characters. The scenes can feel hollow or distanced. And so you can look at the internalizations of your scenes. My previous video was on scene structure, and so you can review that, but look at the places where your character is thinking about things, and maybe you have to deepen those, lengthen those a little bit, make them more connected emotionally to that character. Also, are you using them to reveal world? Again, you want your words to perform double, triple, quadruple duty. Also, look at your sequels. Again, this is the parts in fiction where something big has occurred. It's often a major setback of some sort. It could also be an emotional high. It doesn't always have to be negative. It could be somewhat positive, but they're going to digest that at that point. And so look at those. Are they emotionally impactful? Do you have enough of them? Do you maybe have to lengthen the ones that are there so the reader really connects better with the main character? More common, as I said, are the problems in those valleys. Certain parts of stories are particularly susceptible to slow writing, and you'll want to review these carefully during your edits. Is there enough tension to carry the reader? If not, it's time to reimagine, trim, or edit. There's no space in a novel for a dull chapter, not one. One of the most susceptible places is the story opening. Crafting an opening that grabs the reader is one of the toughest tasks in fiction, no doubt. Stories need rising tension, which sometimes leads to low tension openings. The inclination of newer writers is to ease the reader into the story and the protagonist's life, and it's easing too much. And so the way to combat that is to introduce the character's internal arc early. The opening chapter is where we have not yet reached the inciting incident, and so we're all about the main character in their normal, everyday life. So give them something they want, and that should be related to their internal arc. What are their internal desires? Show that early, show them trying to achieve it in whatever form or fashion you want, and then we get to the inciting incident and things are off and running. Also, prologues. Many readers are put off by prologues. I don't mind them, but they should be done right. The trouble is, you have two story openings, the prologue itself and then chapter 1, and they both have to grab. You cannot have a slow, low-tension prologue. Readers just won't put up with that kind of thing. And they can also take place days, years, even centuries before the first chapter, and so they're just naturally distancing to the reader. So just like story openings, they have to start strong and stay strong throughout. So introduce the character's goal early and use it to keep tension high. Also, the unwritten contract of prologues is that it's going to relate, the prologue and what's happening is going to relate somehow to the story opening, especially the inciting incident, and the story as a whole, and specifically the climax and the denouement. Whatever's being shown, whatever problem is happening or is born in the prologue should be resolved by the end of the story. And so that should be there as well as you're constructing your story, and your prologue in particular. Relaying backstory is another place. We spend so much time on our story and our world. If it's fantasy and sci-fi, we're spending a lot of time on like the science fictional elements, the fantasy, the magic system, what have you. And we want to share that. So that's a natural urge. I get it. but I would suggest using the iceberg rule for backstory. And so icebergs famously show 10%, right, of the iceberg above water and 90% below. You, as the author, want to know 100% of that thing. So we're talking about characters, story, world. You want to know all there is to know about this stuff, but you're only going to reveal 10% of it. And the reader will get the impression that there is another 90% they cannot see. They will infer that stuff. They're really good at it. So are you as you read things. So keep that in mind. Show 10%, imply a whole bunch, and let the reader fill in the rest. On a similar note, explaining how technology, magic, or other complex elements, whether it's a big bureaucracy or something like that, that's involved in your story, resist the urge to explain. If you have to explain, and that happens, of course, make the reader want to know about it first. Then dole it out in bite-sized chunks. Pull back. You can always add more later if people get confused. Again, that's one of the things you can ask your beta readers specifically, but try to pull back greatly on that urge, and then just see if it's enough in the end. And if you have to add a bit more, so be it. During transitions, many stories fall into locomotive writing, where we're saying where everybody goes, every step they take, every turn in the path on the horse that they're riding, or every stop on the train ride that they're taking to Zurich, or whatever. We don't care about that stuff. We care about character interactions, not horse rides. Now, I say that, but you can make those rides interesting if you have some character interaction on the train or on the horse ride or what have you. But if you don't, you have to cut that down to a bare minimum, get the reader from one place to another, narratively speaking, by telling them where they are now, how much time has passed from the last scene, and then get into the scene as quickly as possible. So the rule is make transitions as long as they need to be, but no longer. Also, during emotional lows, authors can linger a bit too long in those sequels. They explore the characters' feelings a bit too much. And so certainly we do want to explore those feelings and show them dealing with what happened to them. But again, you'll have to decide whether or not it's too much. And so again, sequels should be as long as they need to, because they are a valid part of fiction, but no longer. Finally, the denouement. So this is the place after the climax. We're wrapping up the story. So naturally, the pages will be lower tension. That's expected. But there's still a mystery at hand. How have things turned out for the world, for the main character, for those around them? And so the denouement is a time to digest the climax and show how the world has changed for the protagonist. Use that inherent mystery to add a final bit of tension to the closing pages. And so when I was first coming up with this talk, I thought, well, I'm claiming that tension should be on every page, and I'm using the Hunger Games as an example, so I should test it out. And so I took the number of pages, and I put it into a random number generator and picked 3 pages completely at random, and then I looked at them. So the first one was page 27. Katniss is dealing with the aftermath of the lottery and her decision to step in and take Prim's place. Katniss is relaying how after her father's death, her mother was supposed to get a job to support the family, but she didn't. Katniss effectively lost both parents in that mining accident. This forced Katniss to become a parent to herself and Prim, and even her mother. It's one of the lower tension scenes we discussed, but it's still filled with tension. Second one, page 274, Claudius Temple-Smith is one of the announcers for the games. He makes an announcement about the contestants coming to the cornucopia. They are each going to receive, the remaining ones, and there's like 5 or 6 at this point, they're going to receive something they desperately need. And in Katniss's case, it's medicine for Peeta. His leg has suffered a wound, it is infected, and he now has blood poisoning, and he is going to die if he doesn't get that medicine. But it's highly dangerous to go to the cornucopia. All the contestants know about it, and so they're going to be camping out and trying to kill the others along the way. And so they both know this, but Katniss feels like she has no choice. Peeta doesn't want her to go, so he asks her to stay. And so Katniss lies and says she won't go, and Peeta knows what she's going to do and calls her out on it. Katniss says, well, you can't stop me. And Peeta pleads with her not to go. Katniss agrees, but then she gets a package from the outside from Haymitch, and it has a sleeping syrup that they use in District 12. And she uses it to put him to sleep. So Haymitch is helping her out. He knows what's going on, right? And so she puts him to sleep and she goes to the cornucopia. So again, this is not the fight itself at the cornucopia. This is another low tension scene, but it is emotionally charged. One of the most charged in the entire book. Third one, page 312. Katniss and Peeta are eating cold stew, some leftovers from another present they got from their sponsors. And they're so hungry, they eat sloppily to the imagined dismay of Effie Trinket, their handler, one of the officiants from the capital who came to District 12. It is a lighter moment, but the mood shifts the moment the food is gone. They step outside and they're ready to find and defeat Cato. So this is a good example of adding a bit of levity to a scene and then switching things up. And the heaviness of the end of the scene is that much heavier because of that light moment they just had. So wrapping things up, these are just 3 examples. However, I would contend that any page in the Hunger Games would have produced the same effect. Adding tension is a skill that must be cultivated. It's a matter of stripping away the things that don't add to the overall tension. So we plan on the front end to add tension, and I think as we edit, we start to strip away, leaving all the things that add to the tension. And that is a skill that will also develop over time. Eventually, these skills will become second nature. You'll begin pulling the process into your world building so that the world itself, the society, the history, the culture, the available resources, all add to the story tension, or at least potentially do. And then it's up to you to pull those into the story. Getting tension on every page can seem like a challenge at first, but if you take a look at the various types of tension you might add, and then look at how you might leverage them to deepen your story, your characters, your world, it becomes much easier. It is my firm belief, my writing friends, that if you can master the art of adding tension, you can hook readers early and keep them hooked all the way through to the end. Now I'd like to turn it over to you. What are some of the ways you found to hook readers? How do you keep them hooked? Do you find that your stories need to be trimmed and edited to add more tension? Or are you naturally the opposite and need to add more of a personal connection to slow things down and increase the emotional connection to the characters? If you found this talk useful, I hope you'll like and share with those who might gain benefit from it. As I mentioned, I have 2 more mastering fiction videos ready to go, plus a few more that I'd like to add, and some Scrivener how-tos, including how to compile, plus a few more series I'm thinking about adding, so hit subscribe to be notified when those come out. Until next time, dream big, stay positive, and keep writing. Peace, everyone.